From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started with our program today. I'm Guy Lamolinar, and I'm the Communications Officer for the Center for the Book, which is presenting this program in conjunction with the Serial and Government Publications Division today. Just to tell you briefly about the Center for the Book, we're the Reading Promotion Division of the Library of Congress, and we promote books, reading, and literacy nationwide here in Washington and through our 52 state centers for the book. We even have one in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I also need to let you know that we're going to be webcasting and recording this presentation today, so if you ask a question at the end of the program, you'll become a part of the webcast. I also ask you to turn off all your electronic devices. And I need to tell you also that there will be a Q&A at the end of the program, and our speaker will be glad to answer any questions that you have. And following that, there will be a book signing here at this table, and the books are being sold in the back of the room at a discount of 20%. It's now my privilege to introduce to you Terry Sierra. She is the Assistant Chief of the Serial and Government Publications Division, and she will introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Guy. That was lovely. First, I offer my excuses for my runny nose, my cough, and the fact that I may lose my voice, but I'm going to try not to. I'm very happy to be here, despite my cold, and I'll try not to give it to any of you. To introduce our speaker, who I actually just met, but I have known about him through his wife, Arlene Balkansky, who works in my division and is one of our top-notch reference librarians. She started out as a cataloger, I might add, but we've persuaded her and brought her to our side of the world, and she's embraced it. So I have known about Mark for a while. And I will tell you some things about him, about his career highlights, but if you Googled, and you probably have Googled his name or gone to Amazon to look for his books, you probably know that by and large his career has been as a playwright or a screen playwright for actually real celebrities like Goldie Hawn and Steve Martin, who he told me a little bit about today. That was fun. He himself is a celebrity, I think, because he has appeared in a number of episodes in the History Channel series that has the name of the first book, How the States Got Their Shape. And if you haven't read his books, I am here to tell you you should. I've enjoyed them tremendously. I particularly have liked the flexibility of it, because each chapter is its own story. You can read a chapter when you don't have a lot of time, and later you can read another chapter. I now have in my upstairs, I have the first one, and this one, the one that we're going to hear about today, hopefully, I have downstairs. So, and I can go back and read parts that I don't remember easily enough. Plus, his writing style is to me, like, it's like having a conversation with a friend. It's very gentle. I mean that as a compliment. I think when I can read something and it's like listening to a friend, it's just fun for me. So I've enjoyed it. I want to put in one more word before we have Mark come up, and this is about the fact that in the second book there are two chapters, not one, but two chapters about the District of Columbia, of which I'm a proud resident. The first one is about how the district came about and who the players were. The second one is about Eleanor Holmes Norton, our non-delegate, and about the efforts of the people of the district to gain statehood. Thank you for doing that, Mark, because we all forget. And I was particularly interested in one quote in that particular chapter by Representative Dingell from Michigan, where he said, and this is a Democrat, and they've been more favorable to the statehood in D.C. than the Republicans have. But here he said, if they don't like it, they can just pack and leave. And I was like, no, he couldn't have said that. But anyway, that's the quote in the book. So I learned a good deal, and I'm very happy to be able to introduce Mark. And I know we're going to have a very good time listening to what he has to say. So please come up, Mark. And thank you all for coming today. It's very exciting to see a full Mumford. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, and also thank you to your division, Serial and Government Publications, and Guy, thank you, and the Center for the Book for arranging for this event. And thank you, Arlene, my wife who works there. I will just say in passing that anyone, there are some young people here, anyone who's thinking of engaging in a career that may involve research, I would urge you to marry someone who works at the Library of Congress. This isn't planned to say, but you mentioned about Eleanor Holmes Norton. One of the things that I discovered in writing that chapter about her, which actually comes through documents available through this division, is I wondered when the debate about not having voting rights for those who lived in the District of Columbia, when did that become an issue? Answer: when they were writing the Constitution. There was an extraordinary dispute that went on between James Madison on the one hand and George Mason and Patrick Henry on the other. I mentioned it in the book. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it comes right off the page that these guys were nose to nose in this debate. I mean, it was emotional right from the get-go and has remained part of the discourse, this conflict, not ever since. It didn't go to sleep ever since. This book. When I wrote this book, what got me passionate was something very different from when I wrote the first book. The first book deals with why the lines of our states are located where they are. And in the course of writing it, a question started, kind of a thought kind of started germinating in my head, which was that, you know, nobody, to my knowledge, when they were a kid, tell me if I'm wrong, got some young people here, ever said, when I grow up, I want to establish a state line. And so in this book, the people that I write about, they all had a quest in their lives, a personal quest of some kind, and somehow that quest ended up on the map. In researching the book, I came to discover that most of the people involved were not particularly famous people or famous people at all. And among those that were famous, I have to confess, I didn't always know why they were famous. Stephen Douglas. What did he really do? He debated Lincoln. Daniel Webster debated the devil? I don't know. Maybe that was just a short story I read in high school. What did the guy actually do? In one case, it wasn't even a person. Lyman Cutler's neighbor's pig was responsible for 2 British battleships and 400 American troops faced off this close to war, which ultimately didn't erupt, but did alter the boundary between Canada and what is today the state of Washington. In one case, it was only part of a person. Robert Jenkins' ear was severed by a Spaniard, resulted in a war it triggered the war between England and Spain. And one of the upshots of that war is the boundary we have today between Georgia and Florida. But the person I want to talk about today is Thomas Jefferson. And one reason for talking about Thomas Jefferson is how instrumental he was in the founding of the institution where we're gathered today, the Library of Congress. But also bringing Jefferson full circle, if you will, is how important the Library of Congress has been to me in writing this book. So as I move through this discussion, you'll see in some of these background images websites that I used that are available through the Library of Congress. And I consider these these websites, this whole institution really, as part of the legacy of Jefferson's quest, because he had one too. The way I would word his quest is to create a nation where the people had the liberty to pursue happiness. It was an imperfectly pursued quest, and it was a quest that encountered great obstacles. But it's a quest that over the next 200 and some years, I think the nation has come closer to. And I also think it's a quest that you can see on the map. It's not something that jumps off the map, but it's something that with a little dusting powder, if you will, which is what I hope this talk will be, I can make visible to you the imprint of Thomas Jefferson on the American map. So here is the map as it appeared at the end of the American Revolution. What I want to point out about this is that at that point in time, the nation extended only as far west as the Mississippi River and did not yet extend to the Gulf of Mexico. Jefferson, more importantly, these are the states that existed at the end of the Revolution. As you can see, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, much bigger than they are today. I also want to point out to you that Maine was still part of Massachusetts, and Vermont was still part of New York, but in particular that dark area called the Northwest Territory. That was land that the British, with their American colonists, acquired in their victory over the French in the French and Indian War. After the Revolution, it became part of the United States, but it was not part of any state. I've pulled from here, this little piece of text is from a letter Jefferson wrote to a French encyclopedist who had corresponded to him and said, loosely translated, "Wow, tell me about this new country of yours." And so Jefferson did. And one of the things that he said in the letter was, yeah, the Confederation, meaning the Articles of Confederation, but the same is true of the Constitution when it was ratified 1787, has no mechanism to create new states. There's no procedure in place. So Congress, and at this point we're talking about the Continental Congress, created a committee, which Jefferson chaired, to form some procedure, protocols for creating states and governments in the Western Territory. The image in the background, I'll point out, is from the Library of Congress's Century of Lawmaking website, available through American Memory, and it has, for about 100 years, what today we call the Congressional Record. Went by different names in different periods of time, and there are the words. That's where I found the thing about Patrick Henry. It could get pretty exciting. These guys were long-winded then too, but every now and then it's like, wow. So Jefferson was charged with this. And by the way, I'll also point out, it says the Western Territory. In fact, they meant not only that Northwest Territory, but all the land west of the Appalachian Mountains, because for a number of reasons, Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, they too even wanted to be broken up into smaller but more states. Here's the report that Jefferson came back with in 1784. What jumps off this map, probably, as it did for you, probably as it did for me, is that isn't what we did. The page here is from the record of the time. That shows where the names were. Jefferson's proposing these wacky-sounding names to us in most cases. The other thought I had was, Mr. Jefferson, did you just put a ruler down on the map and draw some lines and call it quits? I mean, is that what you did with this assignment? Well, in fact, no. Jefferson had reasons behind this. There were issues that faced the nation that Jefferson believed the original 13 states, and let's call it 15 because Vermont was soon to come into the Union, and it wouldn't be long, everybody knew, until Maine came into the Union, that these states east of the mountains, these original states, they were not going to solve these issues. Slavery, of course, was the biggest of these issues, but there were issues over, economic issues over banking, whether or not to have a national bank, issues over trade and whether there should be a tariff and how tariffs should be. Jefferson believed that if these issues were ever to be resolved, and if this nation was going to really continue to hold together, it would be through what I'm calling in this thing Middle Americans, but really what he I think, envisioned was this next generation of Americans, both chronologically and geographically, that would have the detachment to collectively find the optimum way to solve these problems. So, if you count the number of states that Jefferson has proposed there, it is about equal to maybe even a state or more than the original, those 15 states that would occupy the eastern part of the country. Now, a little footnote here on the legislature here. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was only one legislature. It was called the Continental Congress. No matter how many delegates a state sent to the Continental Congress, each state, one vote. So in the days of the Continental Congress, this really is a very important number to keep track of. 1787, we have the Constitution. We now have two legislative bodies, but this remains still very important in the Senate, where, as you probably know, each state has two representatives. Well, Congress clearly didn't do this. They strayed from the vision of this founding father, something that we hear quite a lot about today. And so I kind of wondered, when did they begin to stray from this vision of this founding father? And the answer, if I remember right, is about 2 weeks after he handed in the report. They started tinkering with it, and they continued to tinker with it. And the final shoe fell 3 years later when they passed what's called the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. Under that, they proposed tentative boundaries for the Northwest Territory, and by then those states further south were already coming into being in a different way. So, of course, you look at this, and again, I suppose your reaction, like mine, is, well, yeah, that's kind of what we have today. Wisconsin's going to get chopped down a little bit, and that horizontal line east and west at the southernmost tip of Lake Michigan, that's going to get adjusted northward in various ways for Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, but that's kind of what they did. Why? You know, it's fair to ask why Jefferson came up with his idea. Why did Congress change it? Why did they come up with this idea? Well, it turns out that those Appalachian Mountains were much more inconvenient then than they would be today when we have railroads. There were no railroads at the time. Rivers were the primary avenue of commerce, and virtually all the rivers west of the Appalachian Mountains flow to the Mississippi River, down to the Gulf, or directly to the Gulf. And in that era, the Mississippi River was controlled on and off, but more on than off, by Spain. And during this period of time, the residents of what we today call Tennessee got very impatient with Congress because it wasn't getting the job done of creating a state for them. Sounds a little like things today, too. So in Tennessee, they simply proclaimed themselves a state. They called it the state of Franklin. And they started to negotiate with Spain for navigational rights on the Mississippi River. The text that I've pulled out here is from that same letter to the French encyclopedist, where he explains that under the Articles of Confederation, but the same, by the way, is true in the Constitution, no state can negotiate a treaty with a foreign nation. And when the people in what is now Tennessee started doing that, suddenly the word united in the phrase United States was appearing incredibly fragile. And Congress got on the stick, and they proceeded to create these new proposed boundaries and fixed boundaries. And in doing so, they engaged in the biggest gerrymander in American history. Think about that slide that was up there a minute ago with Jefferson and the number of votes that this area of the country had compared to the area east of the Appalachians. Well, you can see here that the way Congress did it, only 9 votes compared to probably 15 votes, more or less. You never know exactly how someone will vote. Foreign policy would stay in the hands of the eastern part of the country because treaties under the Constitution are negotiated by the president and ratified by the Senate. And a lot of other issues, the weight would be decided much more by the eastern part of the country. When this happened in 1787, Jefferson was not here. He was in Paris. He was our ambassador to France. But he heard about it. He was not particularly happy. he wrote a letter to his friend James Monroe. That little image up at the top of 5 3/4 pages, that's the letter. He had a lot of things to say about this. I've pulled out a little bit of it to show how profoundly Jefferson thought about what a state should be, how big it should be, what happens if it's too big and the people have divergent interests. How serious is it if it's too big? Well, very serious. He felt would end by separating and becoming our enemies. He was really upset. This is going to come back a little bit later in this talk. Jefferson's going to come back right now because he returns to the United States, gets elected the president, and proceeds to make the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And what I've pulled here is from, again, correspondence from Jefferson. What's interesting to me about this, I don't know if you can see, you probably can't, but the date of that letter is 1803. He's immediately talking about this quest of his. He's using phrases such as giving as much satisfaction to the inhabitants of that province as it does us in acquiring it, and about the necessity of Congress making the best arrangements for its tranquility and security and government. This is the quest of Jefferson, but there's a new wrinkle now. In acquiring all this land, we acquired all these people who did not ask to become citizens of this country. And they did not speak our language. Most of them spoke French. So part of the challenge is how do we bring these people into this country and provide a place where they can, if you will, pursue happiness. Jefferson, in another letter, says that he envisions, and this is still way back in 1803, that the inhabited part of Louisiana, and when he says inhabited and when I say inhabited, forgive me, we're talking about white people, as he was too, will go from Point Coupé to the sea, and that this will become a territory in the state. Well, when I read that as a researcher, I go, that's so cool. Where's Point Coupé? And I go to Google Maps and I see, oh, it's a parish, county, like a county in Louisiana. But I have to wonder, was it a region then, or was it just maybe a point, as its name implies, on the river? How do I find that out? Well, I go to the Library of Congress. This website is the Geography and Map Division. This is a map from 1764, and there you can see it circled, Point Coupé. My circle, actually, I realized this morning in looking at this, blocks the fact that there is no dot there. It was a region already, probably based on a point along the river. But nevertheless, this tells me where Jefferson intends the boundary to be for his anticipated state of Louisiana. And there it is. Well, what you see here is what we saw before. Jefferson has a state in mind that's much smaller than what we know Congress is at some point in the future going to do. And I want to emphasize it because it not only reflects what happened, but the story with Louisiana's boundary is also a microcosm of what's going to happen down the line with so much else in the nation. Louisiana became a state in 1812, and these are the boundaries that Congress assigned to it at that point in time. So it looks like, well, then once again, they've gone and made a much bigger state. But by 1812, the inhabited, if you will, part of the state, which were still predominantly French-speaking people, had migrated, enlarged and migrated further north along the bayous and the rivers to a region, or regions actually, just a little bit south of the northern border of what is today the northern border of Louisiana. So what Congress did was create a boundary that in effect assured these people, we are not going to yank the levers of power away from you. This is a state that will, in effect, remain in your control, and they can pursue their happiness. Think of the difference today between our relations in this country with Louisiana and Canada's relations with the province of Quebec, in which the British did do certain things, but they also yanked the levers of power from the French speakers in the province of Quebec. So we can pat ourselves on the back for that and see the wisdom of Jefferson in that. The route that continues taking us back toward Jefferson begins with this man, Robert Lucas, and this state, Iowa, back in the days when it was the Iowa Territory. Robert Lucas, prior to this, had been the governor of Ohio. I want to just say briefly, in that capacity, he had a really virulent boundary dispute with the territory of Michigan to the north. Two militias face to face. They call it the Toledo War. It, in fact, came very close to war. Michigan was given the Upper Peninsula as a consolation prize, but Robert Lucas got what he wanted for Ohio. He then goes to Ohio. He immediately has virtually the identical kind of boundary dispute with the state to his south, Missouri, only in this case, that's the state, he's the territory, no votes in Congress, no votes for president, only a militia to deal with. Robert Lucas won that one too. But Robert Lucas, the boundary champ, lost round 3, and that's the one that's important to our discussion here, the northern border of Iowa. This is what Robert Lucas had proposed, and the legislature of the Iowa Territory proposed, would be the northern boundary of Iowa. It makes sense in a way. It follows its eastern boundary along the Mississippi to what is today called the Minnesota River, crosses over the state through that, picks up with the Big Sioux River, comes down the Big Sioux River, catches a little bit of the Missouri River down to the southern border at Missouri. When Iowa came up before Congress for statehood, Congressman Samuel Vinton from Ohio, someone that Robert Lucas would have known, said that, in fact, it's about the same size as Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan. And then Vinton went on to tell Congress that you have to remember that those Midwestern states violated the proposal of Thomas Jefferson for political reasons and for equitable representation in the Senate. I want to read to you what Vinton said on the floor of the House of Representatives. What has been the effect of this change? The vast and fertile region between the Ohio, that's that river down bottom right there along those states, between the Ohio, the lakes, meaning the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi, has thus been reduced from 12 to 14 states to 5 at the most that can never have but 10 votes in the Senate. As an equitable compensation to the Western country for this flagrant injustice, I would make a series of small states on the opposite bank of the Mississippi River. And then he proposed the boundary that you see on the map. Iowa had a non-voting delegate there, a man named Augustus Dodge, who did not like this idea. And among other things, he said, that's just an arbitrary line. And the question I want to put in the air here, we'll get back to it a little later, is, was that an arbitrary line? I'll tell you this, it is the line that got enacted. And what I'm showing you here is, I've highlighted it a little from the news coverage of the day when Congress did in fact enact the line that Vinton proposed. This is from the Chronicling America website, from the Serial and Government Publications division here. This is a particular website you can actually access right at home. It's a terrific website for all kinds of stuff in historical newspapers. But we have this question, was it an arbitrary line? And the answer to that, and the continuation of the return of Jefferson, is found in this man, Stephen Douglas. Whoa, here he is. And these states, New Mexico, Arizona, and Kansas, Nebraska. And this part of the story begins after the Mexican War in 1848. This website, by the way, U.S. Geological Survey, not Library of Congress, but nevertheless a great website. This is their interactive national atlas. What I've pulled up for you to see here is the land acquisitions in the United States. And the one I want to call your attention to first is that greenish yellow area. That's what we acquired after the Mexican War. Just above it, that, I don't know if that color has a name, sort of peachy-ish looking area in the Northwest. We acquired that the very same year, 1848, in a treaty with England. And we acquired also a great big national headache. Because up until this point, ever since 1820, slavery in this country had been regulated by the Missouri Compromise, This was a line that Henry Clay came up with when Missouri became a state in 1820. It was located at 36 degrees 30 minutes, which is the southern boundary for pretty much the whole state of Missouri. And the Missouri Compromise said this: no new state or territory north of this line can have slavery, with the exception of Missouri. That's why we have the word compromise in the name. Well, as the South could easily see with this new land, this line wasn't going to work anymore. In not too many years, the non-slaveholding part of the country would greatly outnumber the slaveholding part of the country. So beginning with this acquisition of this land, there were a series of increasingly virulent conflicts in Congress and in the country about slavery that ultimately erupted in the Civil War. The first big conflict occurred in 1850, and Civil War was averted by a package of legislation, which today we know as we call it the Compromise of 1850. One piece of that legislation created the New Mexico Territory, and it was Stephen Douglas who, as chairman of the Committee on Territories, wrote that legislation. In it, it authorized the United States to buy, which they did, a chunk of land from the state of Texas, which at the time went all the way to the Rio Grande, and to make it part of this New Mexico Territory. And in the legislation, Douglas said, yeah, let's do that all the way east to the 103rd meridian, 103 degrees west longitude. Really, Mr. Douglas? 103? You know? Why not 100, you know? This line that you see there is the most brilliant line on the American map, in my opinion. And I say that based on what surfaces 13 years later when the New Mexico Territory is going to be divided to create the Arizona Territory. When that came up, the delegate from the New Mexico Territory was John S. Watts. He, I just mentioned, opted, he did not want to run again, so he was replaced in the next election by a friend of his, Francisco Perea. These two men were extremely significant in keeping the New Mexico Territory loyal to the Union in the Civil War. You'll note that we are right in the middle of the Civil War when this division of the territory is coming up. The big question before Congress was, how do we do it? Do we divide this territory horizontally, or do we divide it vertically? Watts proposed that it be divided vertically, and that he proposed a line along the 109th meridian. When he did, one congressman, William Wheeler from New York, said, it's sort of like Mr. Jefferson, did you just put a ruler on the map? You're just continuing the line that separates Colorado and Utah, which gives us that little four corners thing that we have today. Watts answered that, and in answering it, you can hear echoes of Thomas Jefferson. The first thing he said is, no, if you put the line there, the two territories that will result, and they've altered a little bit because of some land shifts in and around that time, but nevertheless, they'll be virtually equal in size. He then went on and said this: Mexico was compelled to relinquish a portion of her people, endeared to her by 10,000 pleasant memories, and doubly endeared by 10,000 painful forebodings for the future. What the hell is he talking about? Well, when we acquired this land in the Mexican War, just like Louisiana, we acquired a bunch of people who did not ask to be citizens of this country, who did not speak our language. Most of them lived along the Rio Grande Valley, and as you follow Texas up to that area between the two little colors of New Mexico, that's the Rio Grande, and the biggest community was located at Santa Fe. Their forebodings for the future, their biggest fear was a five-letter word, Texas. A group of Anglos, not that many years before, had come into the Mexican province of Tejas. It didn't take very long before they turned it into an independent Republic of Texas. It then became the state of Texas. Texas always claimed its boundary went to the Rio Grande, though they had not yet sent their militia to actually lay claim. But these Hispanic people along that valley and in Santa Fe feared them, even more so as time went on, because Anglos, many of them Texans, were now migrating into the western part of the New Mexico territory. So look at that line that Watts has proposed, and you will see that it puts the Rio Grande pretty securely in the center of the New Mexico territory, and Santa Fe in particular, 3 degrees from Texas, 3 degrees from Arizona, creating a territory and future state 6 degrees wide, and a future state of Arizona 6 degrees wide, more or less, since the Colorado River is mainly its boundary. Very much the principle of Thomas Jefferson is at work in the creation, but it could only happen because Stephen Douglas said 103 degrees. He never said why. We're going to come to something in a moment where he doesn't always tell you why, but damn, it works out in very interesting ways. The second big, let me mention that we have 50 states today. So how close together are they in size? Well, New Mexico is the 5th largest, Arizona the 6th largest. They turned out to be extremely close in size. The next big fight was in 1854 when Kansas came up for statehood, and the question about slavery there. This time Douglas said, look, I think we can avert this whole conflict once and for all simply by relying on the genius of democracy. From here on out, we'll scrap this Missouri Compromise line, and we'll let the people in the state or the territory decide for themselves whether or not to have slavery. And we will begin this with this state of Kansas, territory. Well, no, now it'd be a state of Kansas. It's an idea called popular sovereignty. It really only had one drawback. Nobody liked it. Northerners didn't like it. Southerners didn't like it. Huge conflict. Douglas said, okay, okay, let me revise it a little bit. Watch what happens in his revision to the southern border of Kansas. He proposes Kansas and Nebraska. The conventional wisdom is Nebraskans will vote to prohibit slavery. Kansas will vote to allow slavery. As it turned out, after a good deal of bloodshed, Kansas did not allow slavery. But did you notice what happened to the boundary? It moved up just a little bit. It moved up 1/2 of 1 degree. That left a gap, and that gap resulted in what is today the panhandle of Oklahoma. Why did Douglas do this? Well, he told Congress why he did it, sort of, at the time, and I'd like to read that to you. He said, my attention has been called by the chairman of the Committee on Indian Affairs to the fact that the boundary would divide the Cherokee country, whereas by taking the parallel of 37 degrees, as opposed to 30, it's now 37, north latitude as the southern boundary of Kansas, the line would run between the Cherokees and the Osage. It's very courteous of Mr. Douglas. It's not entirely irrelevant, but the full relevance of it occurred 2 weeks later when that chairman of the Committee on Indian Affairs said in Congress, my committee is maturing a policy upon which the title of the Indians to the lands guaranteed to them by treaty is to be extinguished. And by extinguishing them, which happened quite a bit later because the Civil War got in the way, they ultimately created the state of Oklahoma. So all that was already in the works in 1854 when Kansas-Nebraska Act was coming up. But Douglas moving it also did something else. By moving it up to the 37th parallel, 37 degrees, he created a baseline. And from that baseline, as the years went on, we created the state of South Dakota, North Dakota, right up to the Canadian border. Each of the states in that tier of prairie states has 3 degrees of height. Let's come back to Mr. Vinton and ask, was that line at Iowa an arbitrary line? It's not looking so arbitrary now. Iowa is 3.5 degrees high. Although that kind of begs another question, why move the boundary? Because had he left it in place, Kansas would have been 3.5 degrees high. But remember this Oklahoma thing, because when they did get around to creating Oklahoma, though it is a rather bizarrely shaped state, it is about 3 degrees high. And although this is total speculation on my part, since it didn't get rolling till later, this never came about, but I can't help but wonder if there might have been some effort to get Texas to participate in this for some sort of recompense and create a state of Kansas that might have looked like that. Be that as it may, again, total speculation on my part. I'm not even sure I agree with myself. Be that as it may, with 37 degrees as the baseline, if you go a little further to the west, the nation was able to create a tier of mountainous states. Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, each of them have 4 degrees of height. And during the same era of state making, 6 of our western states have 7 degrees of width. So what we are seeing is a return of state prototypes. And it's beginning to look very similar to Jefferson's original proposal, but bigger. But now there are railroads, and the need for states to be the size Jefferson conceived isn't the nation's changed. So the vision is modified. There's one other way that Jefferson left an imprint on the map, and I want to mention it briefly. One thing that Congress did adopt way back when he made his proposal was that with this land, when it's surveyed, that they use something called the rectangular survey system. Jefferson was a surveyor. He didn't invent this system, but he thought this would be the best system to use. The letter that you're seeing there on the left, where I've highlighted something at the bottom, is a letter he wrote to Governor William Henry Harrison of the territory of Indiana, in which, in that highlighted area, he's basically saying, oh, by the way, I hope you're using this rectangular survey system to mark off the land. Today, when you fly in an airplane east of the Appalachian Mountains and look down, the roads are going to look pretty much like those Virginia roads there. Once you cross the Appalachians and get into the Northwest Territory region and areas further west and look down, you will see roads that probably look pretty much like those roads in Indiana. That is the rectangular survey system. And so what we have is the imprint of Thomas Jefferson on the map. I said at the beginning that the people came from all walks of life. The people who impacted on the lines, they go all the way back to the very beginnings of what became this nation. Roger Williams, I talk about from 1641. Yeah, I went too fast. The picture of the gentleman that's in color down there, it's David Schaefer. He's a Georgia state senator who had a resolution that passed in 2008 in Georgia to correct the boundary between Georgia and Tennessee. There have been Native Americans involved, and I want to just kind of quickly note some of these participations. Chief Green McCurtain sought to create a Native American state that would be called Sequoia in what is today the eastern end of Oklahoma. Sequoia, years earlier, was part of the Cherokee delegation that negotiated what is today the line that divides Oklahoma and Arkansas. I find it sort of meaningful that it is a bent line. Chief Standing Bear's life resulted in altering the boundary between Nebraska and South Dakota. Among African Americans, Edward P. McCabe sought to create a majority African American state in what is today the western half of Oklahoma. Benjamin Banneker was one of the two men, he and Andrew Ellicott, who surveyed the boundary line for the District of Columbia. And as the years have passed, that line has shown itself to be extraordinarily accurate. And this is the man who did the calculations for the field work to tell them where to put the line. He was the Jackie Robinson of his era. It is an incredible gig that an African American at 92 could get hired to do that work. His story is amazing. Eleanor Holmes Norton, as Terry mentioned, very instrumental in her dream, and that of many of the others of us, to create statehood for the District of Columbia. Should that come, it actually would alter a line, because in the District of Columbia, as originally conceived, there was a federal enclave that had very specific boundary. It was called Washington, hence Washington, comma, D.C. The boundary you can see today on the map, it's called Florida Avenue. So that old line that's no longer a boundary that would be altered if she should ever succeed, or someone who follows her. I mentioned Francisco Perea in terms of the New Mexico territory. Luis Ferre was the leading voice in Puerto Rico, urging his fellow Puerto Ricans to vote in favor of becoming the 51st state. Among women, hardest group to find because they weren't given a seat at the table, and I suspect they had much more influence than we have a record of. But we do know that Queen Liliuokalani struggled to prevent Hawaii from becoming part of the United States. She lost that struggle to a man named Sanford Dole, whose family put pineapple in cans. Helena Nichols attended the Kansas Statehood Convention, where their boundaries were laid out. She was not allowed to vote or participate, although they did let her speak. And she was less concerned about the boundaries of Kansas than she was about the boundaries around the voting booth, the boundaries around child custody, and the boundaries around property rights for women. She won 2 of the 3. She didn't get the vote. I have Eleanor Holmes up there twice, partly because, as Terry somewhat suggested, as I got to learn more about just her life, what a remarkable woman, no matter what you think of D.C. statehood, what a remarkable woman she is, but also that we have reached the point where not only are African Americans and women at the table, but we have an African American woman at the table. And so I think that the greatest legacy of Thomas Jefferson and the greatest evidence of the progression toward realizing his quest is that it turns out he is really just one of so many people who've had an impact on the American map. Thank you very much. You want me to just ask a question? So yeah, if there are questions, and someone will cut me off when the time is over. But yes, sir.
Hey, just a quick question. Thank you for coming, first of all. Had a question. Outside of Washington, D.C., do you think the state boundaries are still evolving today? Do you foresee in the future where states will be mixed up into smaller states going forward to help identify?
Yeah. You know, my feeling on that is no. They're fixed. They won't change. And every time I look at any historical atlas, the boundaries of places are always changing. It makes me very uncomfortable. So that's my answer to you. Yes, sir.
A few years back, Congressman Gilbert of Texas proposed retroceding non-federal D.C. to Maryland, kind of built on how Arlington and Alexandria were retroceded to Virginia. What do you think is a more likely outcome, that D.C. becomes a state, or that it eventually becomes a part of Maryland?
I don't know if you could all hear him. He said that there was a proposal recently to retrocede, which means to give back, to Maryland, that portion of the District of Columbia, barring probably a federal enclave, I think is the way that proposal goes, so that rather than become a state, D.C. would become part of Maryland. And he asked, did I think that might be more likely than statehood? By the way, the original, he alluded to this also, the original District of Columbia was a full square. The other half was in Virginia. And if you look at the map today, particularly the map of Arlington County, you will see the lines, the original District of Columbia. Alexandria has expanded its boundaries. Part of King Street, though, you'll see a continuation of what was that part of King Street that was laid out while it was part of the district, because it was laid out right just inside the line. As to your question, I actually don't know if anything changes, which is more likely between statehood or retrocession. Maryland would have to agree to retrocession under the Constitution to change any state line. Any state involved in that change, in other words, if it's 2 states, both states have to agree, and Congress has to agree. So that's one of the factors that are there. So I don't know. Kind of tying back to the first man's question, I sort of wonder with what's going on, the way Virginia is developing, and the way you hear phrases about real Virginians versus Northern Virginians, if there may not be way down the line. And this is totally just me, and I don't know more about this than you folks, probably less than some of you. If there might be something, a state that's composed of the Washington metropolitan area or something, I really don't. All that to say, oh no. Yeah. Question here? Yeah.
Yeah. Like kind of similar to what's going on in Northern Virginia in terms of like how the economic activity in that area is like so much greater than the rest of Virginia. Do you ever see Texas, because like the way their economic and stuff is going, that they might ever secede from the Union?
Well, of course, Governor Perry made a remark about that. I don't know how much history he knows. Texas was a republic for, I think it was 10 years, and acquired tens of millions of dollars of debt as a republic. It didn't work out too well. I don't think Texas would do that. I'll point out, though, that when Texas entered the Union, also when California entered the Union, Congress was not happy about the size of these states. Congress did not create California or Texas. They created themselves. In the case of Texas, they said to Texas, you can subdivide into as many as 5 states. 1845, is that what we're talking about? I forget the date. 48, I guess, or 7. And enters 5 states. The other southern states said, do it. That's 10 votes in the Senate, slave state votes. Texans had so much history, they didn't subdivide. Whether they'd succeed, I don't think they would secede, Texas would secede from the Union. You do hear talk of other states, by the way, of breaking up. There's some in Long Island where they feel they should be a separate state. Several times in California's history and currently, there have been talk about this section or that dividing from the state. So there is wind. And by the way, it did happen once on a large scale. There have been some little small scale trades, but it did happen once. I write about it in the book on a large scale, and that was in the Civil War. The western part of Virginia broke away and formed West Virginia. And I'll tell you real quickly a little thing about that. They had a big, it was not conducive to slavery out there in the mountains. In all kinds of ways, they were a very unhappy part of Virginia, not just regarding slavery, for all the way back. And when the war broke out, they had a convention in Wheeling, Virginia, at which they said, hey, they seceded from the Union, let's secede from Virginia. And Francis Pierpont, who's the gentleman I write about, stood up and said, you can't. The federal government has said it's illegal to secede. They're not going to recognize a state that has seceded from a state. Pandemonium. I mean, this man was a little bit in danger, I would say, for a few moments before he said, well, what we have to do is come up with some way of seceding based on the illegality of secession. Now, only a lawyer can do that. But Francis Pierpont was a lawyer. He's a very good lawyer. And I won't go through it, but he came up with an absolutely eye-popping legal tap dance. And it worked to create the state of West Virginia. Yeah. Other questions? Are we good? Yes, you.
What's your favorite state?
My favorite state? Do you mean in terms of its shape or just my favorite state?
What's your favorite state's history?
My favorite state is Wisconsin. Because,
Talk about that.
yeah, there you go. Well, it's a great state. I don't know if this is in your paper or not, but I went to the University of Wisconsin, and I had a girlfriend there. She's standing in the back of the room. She's my wife. We have 2 boys. One of them graduated from the University of Wisconsin and is there now. And the boy who graduated, there he is back there, works for Senator Herb Kohl, who may be in your paper, who's the senior senator from Wisconsin. So for me, it's the state of Wisconsin. Excellent question. Thank you.
Right back there. Do you post in the book where the state lines are based on cultural lines as opposed to the official state lines today, and what the map of the United States will look like as such?
I didn't catch the word that obey.
Cultural political lines, such as someone alluded to Northern Virginia.
Yeah.
In California, which would possibly maybe 5 to 6 different.
Right.
cut out.
You know, I don't, but you know, there's a wonderful book. I'm going to be embarrassed because I'm not going to be able to remember the title. It just came out about the cultural history of the map, and how when you look at those lines as opposed to the state lines, those divides remain so much more relevant today than the state lines. Oh, I wish I could have been. I met the author. He's a wonderful guy, and title is not coming up. I wish someone here may know of it, but there is a book on that. Yeah, it's a wonderful book. I read it. I just can't remember the name.
Don't run for president.
Yeah. No plans to do that. Any other questions? Are we good? Okay, well, thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.